Power usually changes people. It narrows their vision. It hardens their instincts. It teaches them to justify what they once questioned. Marcus Aurelius believed the opposite. He believed that power was dangerous, not because it corrupted others, but because it exposed the self. He believed that authority stripped away illusion, that it revealed character rather than created it. And yet, against his own nature, he ruled the largest empire on earth. This is the paradox at the center of his life. Marcus Aurelius did not seek greatness in the Roman sense. He did not chase glory, conquest, or legacy. He did not imagine himself as a heroic figure carved into stone. He imagined himself as temporary, replaceable, a man passing briefly through an immense and indifferent universe. And yet history placed him at its center. He was born into privilege, trained for responsibility, and elevated into power by a system that valued stability above all else. Rome did not choose Marcus Aurelius because he was ambitious. It chose him because he was restrained, because he was thoughtful, because he seemed unlikely to abuse what he was given. That alone made him rare. By the time he became emperor, Rome stretched from the Atlantic to the deserts of Syria. Its borders were under constant pressure. Its politics were fragile. Its wealth depended on order, and its order depended on force. To rule such a system required decisiveness, violence, and control. Marcus Aurelius believed in none of these as virtues. He believed in discipline, not domination, in endurance, not triumph, in mastering the self before attempting to command others. He believed that anger was weakness, that pride was a distraction, and that most human suffering came not from circumstance, but from judgment. These were not public speeches. They were private convictions. What makes Marcus Aurelius extraordinary is not that he ruled wisely, though he often did, but that he doubted constantly. He questioned his own impulses. He reminded himself again and again that power was temporary, praise was meaningless, and death was inevitable. While other emperors commissioned monuments, Marcus wrote reminders to himself, not for publication, not for students, not for history. He wrote them late at night in tents along frozen frontiers, surrounded by soldiers and the distant sounds of war. He wrote them as warnings, as corrections, as quiet instructions to a mind under pressure. These writings would later be called meditations, but at the time they were not philosophy, they were survival. Because Marcus Aurelius did not rule in an age of peace. His reign was defined by crisis. Plague swept through the empire, killing millions and hollowing out cities. Wars dragged on for years along the northern borders, fought not for expansion, but for survival. Betrayal emerged from within his own household, and beneath it all lay a question he could never escape. Can a man remain good while exercising absolute power? This question haunted him. He did not answer it with certainty. He answered it with effort. Again and again Marcus returned to the same ideas, that nature was indifferent, that life was short, that control was limited, and that meaning came not from outcomes, but from conduct. He reminded himself that he could lose everything except his ability to choose how he responded. This was not optimism. It was discipline. And yet, discipline has limits. For all his restraint, Marcus Aurelius made decisions that shaped the future in ways he could not undo. His greatest failure was not philosophical, but personal. Despite everything he believed, despite every warning he wrote to himself, he entrusted the empire to a son unprepared to carry its weight. In that single choice, The fragile balance he maintained collapsed. History would remember him as the last of the 5 good emperors, a ruler whose death marked the end of Rome's golden age, a philosopher on a throne, a man praised for wisdom in a world built on force. But this reputation hides something more unsettling. Marcus Aurelius did not believe wisdom guaranteed success. He did not believe virtue protected against tragedy. He did not believe philosophy could fix the world. He believed it could only help a person endure it. That belief shaped every part of his life. This is not a story about perfection. It is a story about restraint under pressure, about thought tested by reality, about a man who ruled, not because he wanted to, but because he believed duty demanded it. And it raises a question that still matters. What happens when the most powerful person in the world believes that power itself is a burden? That question is where his life begins. Marcus Aurelius was born into a world that already expected something of him, even if it did not yet know what that something would be. Rome, in the early 2nd century, was orderly, confident, and deeply conscious of hierarchy. Status mattered. Reputation mattered. Lineage mattered. Marcus's family occupied a position of quiet prominence within this structure, respected, connected, and stable, but not recklessly ambitious. This balance was crucial. In imperial Rome, families that sought power too visibly often attracted suspicion, and suspicion could be fatal. Marcus grew up surrounded by examples of how proximity to authority shaped behavior. From an early age, he learned that public life required restraint. Words were remembered, gestures interpreted. Emotion displayed too freely could be misread as weakness or threat. This atmosphere cultivated caution, not fear, a careful attentiveness to consequence. Ancient accounts describe Marcus as unusually serious even in youth, not withdrawn, but deliberate, not joyless, but measured. While other boys of the elite trained themselves for performance, rhetoric as spectacle, confidence as dominance, Marcus leaned toward discipline. He listened intently. He observed others closely. He absorbed habits before asserting opinions. This temperament did not make him passive, it made him receptive. His education followed the traditional Roman elite path: literature, rhetoric, law, and philosophy. But Marcus did not treat education as a tool for advancement alone. He treated it as formation. Tutors remarked on his diligence and endurance. He did not rush mastery. He repeated exercises. He accepted correction without visible resentment. These habits mattered more than brilliance. Rome valued eloquence, but Marcus valued control. He trained himself to endure boredom, discomfort, and repetition, traits that rarely draw admiration, but quietly prepare a person for long responsibility. Philosophy entered his life early, not as abstraction, but as orientation. Among the schools available to a Roman aristocrat, Stoicism resonated with Marcus immediately. It did not promise pleasure or escape. It did not flatter the ego. It emphasized discipline, impermanence, and responsibility, themes that matched the world Marcus already inhabited. Stoicism offered him a language for instincts he already possessed. Where other philosophies suggested retreat from public life, Stoicism insisted that duty remained binding regardless of personal preference. It taught that character mattered most precisely when circumstances were harsh. For a young man being drawn slowly toward power, this message felt not restrictive, but stabilizing. Marcus did not adopt Stoicism to feel exceptional. He adopted it to remain grounded. His life changed decisively when Emperor Hadrian noticed him. Hadrian was experienced, cautious, and deeply concerned with succession. He understood that Rome's greatest danger lay not in foreign enemies, but in internal instability. Choosing the wrong successor could undo decades of careful governance. Marcus stood out not because he was forceful, but because he was restrained. Hadrian admired intelligence tempered by humility. Marcus displayed seriousness without arrogance, discipline without rigidity. These qualities suggested reliability, a trait Rome valued more than brilliance. Marcus was brought closer to the imperial center. This was not a single moment, but a gradual incorporation into responsibility. He was adopted into a succession plan designed to minimize risk. Through Antoninus Pius, Marcus entered a household defined by moderation, patience, and administrative continuity. Antoninus became a living model. He ruled without spectacle. He avoided unnecessary wars. He respected institutions. Under his governance, Rome experienced stability not because of conquest, but because of consistency. Marcus observed this closely. He learned that power could be exercised quietly, that authority did not require intimidation to function. This lesson stayed with him. Under Antoninus, Marcus's daily life became increasingly structured. He attended legal proceedings. He reviewed administrative matters. He watched how disputes were resolved, not through force, but through procedure. This exposure trained him for the realities of governance long before he carried the title. It also revealed the cost. Marcus saw that rulership was not a sequence of decisive moments, but an accumulation of attention. The same problems returned in altered form. The same demands repeated endlessly. Governance required stamina more than inspiration. This realization shaped his character deeply. He trained himself to accept routine without resentment, to approach repetition as obligation rather than burden. Stoicism reinforced this discipline, framing endurance as virtue rather than sacrifice. Yet even as Marcus was prepared for authority, he sensed the tension growing within him. Philosophy encouraged humility, detachment, and acceptance of impermanence. Imperial life demanded decisiveness, hierarchy, and command. Marcus understood that these worlds would eventually collide. He did not attempt to resolve this tension early. He prepared to endure it. Marcus practiced restraint deliberately. He avoided luxury where possible. He dressed plainly. He accustomed himself to discomfort. These choices were not symbolic acts of virtue. They were rehearsals. He believed that habits formed before power determined behavior under it. This belief was central. Marcus understood that no amount of philosophical knowledge could compensate for undisciplined habit. Self-control had to be practiced before it was required. Otherwise, power would amplify weakness rather than restraint. By the time Marcus was formally designated as heir, his character had already been shaped by years of expectation. He did not imagine power as liberation. He imagined it as constraint, a narrowing of freedom rather than its expansion. This awareness distinguished him from many who sought authority. He did not desire the throne. He prepared for it. Rome, for its part, believed it had chosen wisely. Marcus promised continuity without ambition, stability without excess. He appeared unlikely to abuse authority and unlikely to fracture the system he inherited. Yet preparation does not guarantee outcome. The peace Marcus observed under Antoninus Pius was fragile. Beneath it lay pressures building slowly at the borders and within society itself. The empire Marcus would one day rule would demand more than patience. Early life had shaped his mind. Formation had disciplined his instincts. But nothing in education could fully prepare him for what power would require when theory met reality. That reckoning awaited him, and when it arrived, Marcus Aurelius would discover whether discipline formed in quiet observation could withstand command in a world that refused to remain stable. Marcus Aurelius did not turn to Stoicism to escape the world. He turned to it because escape was impossible. From the outside, Stoicism is often misunderstood as emotional suppression or quiet resignation. In Marcus's life, it was neither. It was a discipline designed for people who could not withdraw, people trapped inside obligation, visibility, and consequence. Stoicism did not promise peace. It promised clarity under pressure. At its core, Stoicism begins with a hard division, the separation between what depends on us and what does not. This was not a comforting idea. It stripped away many illusions people rely on for emotional safety. Reputation, health, power, the behavior of others, all of these were declared unstable, unreliable, and ultimately uncontrollable. What remained was judgment. For Marcus, this distinction was not academic. As a future ruler, he could influence outcomes but never guarantee them. Stoicism offered a way to act decisively without tying self-worth to success. This mattered deeply in a world where failure could destroy reputations, provoke rebellion, or cost lives. The philosophy demanded that Marcus accept uncertainty without paralysis. Stoicism taught that anger was not a reaction imposed from outside, but a judgment formed within. Insult did not wound the mind unless the mind agreed to be wounded. Loss did not destroy a person unless meaning was attached to what had been lost. These ideas were severe. They offered no sympathy, no indulgence, and no permission to dwell in grievance. Stoicism did not ask how Marcus felt. It asked how he judged. This appealed to him precisely because it was demanding. Marcus was not drawn to philosophies that promised pleasure or comfort. Epicureanism, with its emphasis on tranquility through withdrawal and moderated pleasure, held little appeal. His life would never allow retreat. His responsibilities would only increase. He needed a system that functioned under exposure, scrutiny, and risk. Stoicism was built for that environment. It assumed that life would be difficult. It assumed injustice would occur. It assumed people would behave irrationally. Rather than offering solutions to these problems, it offered a way to remain intact while confronting them. This is why Stoicism appealed especially to rulers. Power amplifies emotional consequence. A minor irritation for a private citizen can become cruelty when backed by authority. Stoicism recognized this danger. It insisted that those with power must discipline themselves more severely than others, not less. Marcus absorbed this lesson early. He trained himself to examine his impulses before acting on them, to delay reaction, to question whether irritation arose from necessity or ego, to remind himself that his position magnified harm as easily as it magnified benefit. Stoicism framed leadership not as privilege, but as moral exposure. The more power one held, the less excuse one had for emotional indulgence. This belief shaped Marcus's inner life profoundly. He treated his own thoughts as a battlefield, a place where vigilance was required. The enemy was not external chaos, but internal distortion. Anger masquerading as justice, pride disguised as confidence, fatigue interpreted as entitlement. Stoicism demanded constant correction. Marcus understood that the mind naturally drifts toward comfort, resentment, and self-importance. Stoic practice existed to counteract that drift. This is why repetition mattered so deeply to him. Principles were not meant to be admired once and remembered. They were meant to be enforced daily. In this sense, Stoicism functioned less like belief and more like hygiene. Neglect led to decay. Another central Stoic principle Marcus embraced was impermanence. Everything, bodies, institutions, reputations, empires, existed in flux. This was not presented as tragedy, but as fact. To resist it was to suffer unnecessarily. Marcus did not find this idea depressing. He found it liberating. If everything passed, then nothing deserved absolute attachment. Praise did not elevate. Blame did not define. Power did not confer immortality. This perspective allowed Marcus to rule without illusion. He could act decisively while remembering that his actions would one day be forgotten. This humility was not weakness. It was insulation. Stoicism protected Marcus from becoming intoxicated by his own authority. It reminded him that emperors before him had vanished, and emperors after him would do the same. That Rome itself was a temporary arrangement within a vast and indifferent universe. Such thoughts might have paralyzed a different temperament. For Marcus, they clarified priorities. If outcomes were temporary, then conduct mattered more. If success faded, then integrity endured, at least within the self. Stoicism shifted Marcus's attention away from recognition and toward alignment with reason. Yet Stoicism did not encourage passivity. This is a critical point. Marcus did not believe that accepting fate meant refusing action. Stoicism rejected despair, not effort. One was expected to act fully within one's role, even while accepting that results lay beyond control. This created a demanding psychological posture. Marcus had to commit himself entirely to decisions whose outcomes he could not guarantee. He had to issue commands knowing they might fail. He had to punish wrongdoing without certainty of justice. He had to govern in good faith, despite knowing that error was inevitable. Stoicism did not remove this burden. It normalized it. The philosophy taught Marcus that anxiety arose from demanding certainty where none existed. The solution was not better prediction, but better judgment. Act reasonably, accept consequence, adjust when necessary, repeat. This cyclical discipline mirrored governance itself. Stoicism also shaped how Marcus viewed other people. Rather than dividing the world into allies and enemies, Stoicism framed others as participants in the same flawed human condition. People acted badly not because they were evil, but because they misunderstood what was good for them. This belief encouraged patience rather than vengeance. It did not eliminate punishment. It restrained cruelty. Marcus believed that anger damaged the ruler more than the target, that harshness, once normalized, spread beyond its original justification. Stoicism, therefore, served as a brake, slowing reaction long enough for reason to intervene. This restraint distinguished Marcus from many of his contemporaries. Yet Stoicism exacted a cost. It demanded emotional containment. It discouraged venting, indulgence, and release. Marcus bore frustration privately, often without relief. His writings reveal a man constantly reinforcing boundaries around his own reactions. This inward discipline was isolating. He could not share doubts publicly. He could not confess fatigue without weakening authority. Stoicism became both refuge and prison, a place where he could think honestly but alone. This solitude deepened as power increased. The Stoic ideal of the inner citadel, A mental space immune to external disturbance appealed strongly to a ruler whose outer world was perpetually unstable. Marcus fortified this inner space deliberately, returning to it whenever circumstances threatened to overwhelm judgment. But fortifications can become walls. Stoicism gave Marcus coherence, but not comfort. It sharpened perception, but did not dull pain. It allowed endurance, but not escape. This distinction is essential to understanding his character. Marcus Aurelius did not live serenely. He lived deliberately. The philosophy he practiced was not about happiness. It was about remaining capable under strain. It allowed him to rule without surrendering entirely to bitterness, fear, or indulgence. But it also left him exposed to a difficult truth. Stoicism could discipline the self, but not the world. It could restrain one man, but not history. It could prepare Marcus for power, but not guarantee what power would produce. This limitation did not discredit the philosophy. It defined its scope. As Marcus moved fully into command, Stoicism would be tested not in thought, but in action. The frontier wars, the plague, and the slow erosion of stability would force him to apply these principles where consequence was unavoidable and error irreversible. Stoicism had shaped his mind. Power would test whether that shaping was enough. And soon, philosophy would be measured not by coherence, but by endurance under fire. Marcus Aurelius did not cross a clear line between preparation and command. Power arrived gradually, pressing down long before it formally settled. For years before he became emperor in name, Marcus lived under the expectation of rule. He was visible, observed, measured. Every gesture was interpreted. Every statement was remembered. This slow exposure shaped him more deeply than any sudden coronation could have. Rome did not believe in accidental rulers. By the 2nd century, the empire had learned, through bloodshed, what careless succession produced. Marcus's rise was therefore managed carefully, not as a reward, but as a safeguard. His adoption into the imperial line placed him inside a structure designed to prevent instability above all else. That structure was cautious, deliberate, and unforgiving. Under Antoninus Pius, Marcus learned governance not through spectacle, but through repetition. Administration dominated his days: petitions, legal judgments, financial, oversight, provincial concerns. These were the unglamorous mechanisms that sustained empire. Marcus absorbed them patiently, understanding that power expressed itself most often not through dramatic decisions, but through routine ones. This routine trained endurance. It also trained humility. Antoninus ruled quietly, avoiding unnecessary wars and theatrical authority. His reign demonstrated that stability could be maintained through consistency rather than conquest. Marcus internalized this lesson deeply. He did not associate leadership with domination, but with maintenance. To rule Rome was not to remake it. It was to keep it functioning. This perspective shaped Marcus's approach when authority finally became his. In 161, with Antoninus's death, Marcus inherited a system already under strain. The empire appeared orderly on the surface, but pressure was accumulating beyond visibility. The decision to rule jointly with Lucius Verus reflected this uncertainty. Shared power was meant to distribute risk. It acknowledged that no single individual could manage the empire alone. For Marcus, it also tested Stoic restraint. Philosophy valued clarity of judgment. Politics demanded compromise. Marcus accepted the arrangement without protest. This acceptance reveals something essential about his character. He did not equate authority with ego. He saw power as obligation, not possession. If Rome required division to survive, then division was acceptable. Yet division rarely remains balanced. Lucius Verus gravitated toward comfort and display, Marcus toward responsibility and labor. Over time, governance settled unevenly. Marcus absorbed legal and administrative burdens while Lucius pursued the pleasures of rank. This imbalance was not openly challenged. Marcus did not confront it publicly or attempt to assert dominance. Stoicism discouraged resentment toward circumstances beyond control. He focused instead on fulfilling what he believed was required of him. This quiet assumption of responsibility defined his early reign. Becoming emperor did not remove uncertainty. It magnified it. Every decision Marcus made carried consequences across provinces he would never see, and populations he would never meet. Law, once abstract, became personal. Punishment was no longer theoretical. Mercy, once a virtue, now carried political risk. Stoicism offered no escape from these realities. Instead, it reframed them. Marcus approached rulership as a role assigned by circumstance, not destiny. This framing mattered. It prevented indulgence in self-importance. It also intensified accountability. Roles must be performed regardless of comfort. From the beginning, Marcus understood that power isolated. An emperor could listen, but could not confide freely. Advisors filtered information. Praise surrounded him. Criticism arrived indirectly, if at all. The clarity Stoicism demanded became harder to maintain in an environment designed to obscure it. Marcus compensated by leaning inward. He questioned motives relentlessly. He delayed reactions. He trained himself to distinguish necessity from impulse. Stoicism functioned here as a brake, slowing decisions long enough for reason to assert itself. But reason could not delay indefinitely. Crises emerged almost immediately. Threats along the eastern frontier escalated. Unrest along the Danube intensified. Resources were stretched. Marcus faced a reality that contradicted the peace he had observed under Antoninus. The empire he inherited was not collapsing, but it was no longer stable. This realization altered Marcus's relationship to power. He no longer viewed governance as preservation alone. It became containment, holding systems together long enough for continuity to survive. Containment is exhausting. It demands vigilance without resolution. It offers little satisfaction. Success is invisible. Failure is immediate. Marcus adjusted to this reality with discipline rather than optimism. Stoicism supported this adjustment. It taught him to expect resistance rather than harmony. To accept that order required effort without guarantee. To govern without expectation of reward. Marcus internalized these lessons fully, even as they narrowed his emotional range. He became more reserved, more controlled, more solitary. Yet restraint did not make him detached. Marcus remained engaged in detail. He reviewed cases personally. He sought fairness over expedience. He resisted excess punishment even when fear demanded it. This moderation preserved legitimacy at a time when force alone could not. But moderation also required stamina. As emperor, Marcus discovered that the burden of power lay not in its visibility, but in its repetition. Decisions returned endlessly in altered form. Problems never vanished, only shifted. Each resolution created new obligations. Stoicism helped Marcus endure this cycle without illusion. He reminded himself that frustration arose from expectation. That impatience signaled attachment to outcomes beyond control. That duty did not diminish because success was uncertain. These reminders did not make rulership lighter, they made it survivable. By the time war demanded his full attention, Marcus had already learned the hardest lesson of power, that clarity does not eliminate burden. It clarifies it. The philosopher-emperor did not rule because he believed he could fix the world. He ruled because the world required someone to bear its weight, and he accepted that weight fully. But the transition from governance to war would test this acceptance more severely than administration ever could. Philosophy could guide judgment in the Senate. On the frontier, judgment would collide with necessity. Becoming emperor had prepared Marcus for responsibility. War would test whether preparation was enough. Marcus Aurelius did not inherit a single war. He inherited a condition in which war never truly ended. For generations, Rome had grown accustomed to the belief that order was permanent. Borders expanded, rebellions were crushed, and prosperity flowed from conquest. By the time Marcus ascended to power, that assumption was quietly dying. Pressure built along the empire's edges, not as isolated threats, but as a slow, grinding force that refused to disappear. War under Marcus Aurelius was not heroic. It was repetitive, exhausting, and unresolved. The northern frontier along the Danube became the center of gravity for his reign. Germanic tribes pressed southward, driven by migrations, scarcity, and pressures Rome barely understood. These were not enemies seeking glory, but survival. They tested Rome not with decisive invasions, but with persistence. Marcus responded by going north. This decision shaped everything that followed. Rather than govern from Rome and delegate danger to others, Marcus chose presence. He traveled with the legions, shared their living conditions, and endured the same physical discomforts. This was not theater. It was a statement of responsibility and an acknowledgement of reality. War was no longer an event to be managed from afar. It was a way of life. Life on the frontier stripped away illusion. Days were governed by routine, patrols, logistics, negotiations, skirmishes that achieved little beyond temporary relief. Nights were long and cold. Soldiers waited more than they fought, and waiting drained morale more effectively than defeat. Marcus lived inside this rhythm for years. This was where Stoicism met attrition. Philosophy can prepare a mind for crisis. It is less often tested by monotony. The frontier wars did not present Marcus with moments of decisive action followed by relief. They presented him with endless repetition, a cycle of effort without closure. Stoicism taught acceptance of what lay beyond control. The frontier tested how often that acceptance had to be renewed. Marcus wrote many of his private reflections during these campaigns. The tone of his writing suggests a man struggling not with fear, but with erosion, the slow wearing down of resolve. He reminded himself repeatedly to remain patient, to avoid bitterness, and to treat hardship as ordinary. Hardship, in his view, was not exceptional. It was expected. This expectation allowed him to endure conditions that would have broken rulers less disciplined. He slept little. He dealt with illness. He absorbed reports of casualties without visible reaction. He remained measured when outcomes disappointed. Yet restraint did not remove cost. The wars demanded decisions that Stoicism could not soften. Marcus authorized violence not because he glorified it, but because retreat would invite collapse. Entire populations were displaced. Settlements were destroyed. Lives were spent to maintain borders that might not hold. He understood the contradiction clearly. Stoicism valued human reason and dignity. Empire depended on force. Marcus did not reconcile these principles. He endured their collision. He chose what he believed was necessary while acknowledging its moral weight. This awareness distinguished him from conquerors who celebrated violence as destiny. Marcus did not celebrate. He endured. As the wars dragged on, the empire faced a crisis far worse than any invading army. A devastating plague spread through Roman territories, carried by returning soldiers and trade routes that once symbolized prosperity. Cities emptied, armies weakened. Entire regions were hollowed out by disease. The emperor could command legions. He could not command nature. Stoicism offered Marcus language for this helplessness. It taught him that illness, death, and decay were part of the natural order. Resistance lay not in denial, but in response. He organized relief, maintained discipline, and continued to govern as the empire suffered losses beyond calculation. But philosophy did not anesthetize grief. Marcus watched the human infrastructure of Rome erode. Soldiers died not in battle, but in camps. Officials vanished from illness. The systems he relied on grew fragile. Every decision carried greater risk because fewer resources remained to absorb error. This environment intensified isolation. An emperor in peace can distribute responsibility. An emperor in crisis absorbs it. Marcus carried knowledge that could not be shared publicly. The scale of loss, the limits of recovery, the understanding that Rome was no longer advancing but merely holding. Holding became the goal. The wars Marcus fought were defensive, not triumphant. Rome was no longer expanding its frontiers. It was resisting pressure long enough to survive another generation. This required a different kind of leadership, one focused on endurance rather than victory. Stoicism was uniquely suited to this reality. The philosophy taught that success was not defined by outcome, but by conduct. Marcus internalized this deeply. He judged himself not by territory gained, but by whether he acted rationally under constraint. This standard was demanding. It required him to accept failure without despair and success without pride. Victories were temporary. Losses were instructive. Neither justified emotional excess. The frontier wars reshaped Marcus physically and mentally. Ancient sources describe a ruler worn by effort rather than indulgence. He aged quickly. Illness became frequent. His body bore the cost of prolonged exposure to hardship, yet he did not withdraw. Presence mattered. Soldiers respected a ruler who endured alongside them. Marcus did not inspire devotion through charisma or promises of glory. He inspired trust through consistency, through the quiet signal that he would not abandon the front even when victory was uncertain. This trust stabilized the army, but deepened Marcus's burden. Leadership, under these conditions, required emotional containment. Fear could not be displayed. Doubt could not be expressed. Marcus relied increasingly on internal discipline to manage reactions that had nowhere else to go. Stoicism became less a philosophy and more a survival mechanism. He reminded himself that resentment was useless, that exhaustion did not excuse cruelty, that irritation toward subordinates only weakened command. These reminders were repeated because conditions constantly provoked the opposite response. War narrows moral vision. It simplifies complex human realities into enemy and ally, threat and asset. Marcus resisted this narrowing deliberately. He viewed opponents not as embodiments of evil, but as participants in forces larger than either side. This perspective did not prevent violence. It restrained hatred, yet restraint did not guarantee wisdom. The longer the wars continued, the clearer it became that Rome could not impose permanent solutions. Treaties broke, tribes regrouped, pressure returned. Marcus learned that empire could delay change, but not prevent it. This realization altered his understanding of legacy. He no longer imagined his reign as one that would reshape history dramatically. He measured success in delay, in holding the line long enough for continuity to survive his death. Stoicism helped him accept this modest ambition. It taught him that seeking permanent solutions in an impermanent world was a source of suffering. The ruler's task was not to perfect history, but to act responsibly within it. This acceptance did not bring relief. It brought clarity. Marcus understood that the wars would outlast him, that the frontier would remain unstable, that Rome's future depended on forces beyond any individual ruler. His responsibility was limited, but still immense. He chose to bear it fully. As years passed, the cumulative weight of war, plague, and governance took its toll. Marcus's health declined further. His energy waned. Yet he remained engaged, refusing to retreat into ceremonial distance. Stoicism taught him that withdrawal in the face of obligation was not virtue. Even as his body weakened, his sense of duty hardened. War had tested Marcus Aurelius not as a strategist, but as a human being under sustained pressure. It revealed the strengths of Stoicism: endurance, restraint, clarity, and its limits. Philosophy could not resolve conflict. It could only guide response. Marcus responded with discipline rather than despair. He did not emerge victorious in the traditional sense. There were no decisive endings, no lasting peace secured by his hand. What he achieved was less visible, but no less demanding. He preserved coherence. In a world that pushed relentlessly toward chaos, Marcus maintained internal order. He governed without surrendering to bitterness. He commanded without indulging cruelty. He accepted loss without collapsing into nihilism. War did not prove Stoicism right. It proved it usable. But endurance extracts a price. And as the wars dragged on, that price would be paid not only by Marcus's body, but by the fragile balance he maintained between philosophy and life. The frontier had tested his capacity to rule under fire. The next test would strike closer, where philosophy offered the least protection. At home, Marcus Aurelius did not write meditations to teach. This is the most important fact to understand about the work, and the one most often forgotten. The text that would later make him famous as a philosopher was never intended for readers. It was not organized for publication, refined for clarity, or shaped for persuasion. There was no audience in mind, no students, no citizens, no future generations. There was only one reader, himself. Marcus wrote meditations as a form of mental discipline. A private space where he could correct his thinking, restrain his impulses, and remind himself of principles he already knew, but could easily forget under pressure. The repetition is deliberate. The tone is austere. The language is often blunt. This was not philosophy as performance. It was philosophy as maintenance. The structure of the text reflects its purpose. There is no narrative progression, no argument built carefully from premise to conclusion. Instead, there are fragments, reminders written as commands, warnings, and corrections. Do not be distracted. Do not be angry. do not imagine you are important. These are not insights discovered for the first time. They are instructions repeated because repetition was necessary. Marcus understood something many thinkers did not. Knowing an idea is not the same as living it. As emperor, he was surrounded by incentives to forget everything Stoicism taught. Power encourages indulgence. Authority dulls self-criticism. Praise erodes restraint. Meditations existed to counteract these forces. The work reveals a man deeply aware of his own weaknesses. Marcus does not write like someone confident in moral superiority. He writes like someone constantly on the verge of failing his own standards. He warns himself against impatience, cruelty, vanity, and despair, not because he condemns these traits in others, but because he recognizes them in himself. This self-suspicion is central. Stoicism taught that the mind must be guarded, because it is easily corrupted by habit and circumstance. Marcus treated his own thoughts as something to be monitored, corrected, and restrained. He did not trust himself automatically. The emperor of Rome, commanding armies and issuing laws, privately questioned his own reactions to insult, inconvenience, and fatigue. He reminded himself that other people acted from ignorance, not malice, that irritation was a failure of judgment, that death was ordinary, that reputation was meaningless. These reminders were not comforting, they were stabilizing. Much of Meditations is written in the second person, a direct address to the self. This gives the work its unusual intensity. Marcus is not explaining Stoicism, he is enforcing it. Remember, stop, consider. The voice is firm, sometimes severe. There is little sentimentality. Marcus does not console himself with hope. He disciplines himself with realism. This tone reflects the conditions under which much of the work was written. Marcus composed many of these notes during military campaigns, far from Rome, surrounded by uncertainty. The repetition of Stoic principles was a way to preserve internal order when external order was collapsing. When surrounded by chaos, the mind became the last territory he could fully govern. In this sense, Meditations was a refuge, but not an escape. It did not offer relief from responsibility. It reinforced it. Marcus repeatedly reminds himself that he is part of a larger whole, the Roman state, humanity, nature itself. This perspective reduced personal grievance and inflated obligation. To see oneself as small was not to become passive, but to become disciplined. He was not writing to feel better. He was writing to act better. One of the most striking features of Meditations is its absence of triumph. There are no declarations of success, no satisfaction with progress. Marcus never congratulates himself. Improvement is assumed to be incomplete. Failure is assumed to be ongoing. This humility was not theatrical, it was necessary. Power isolates. It removes honest feedback. It surrounds the ruler with agreement and flattery. Meditations functioned as a counterweight to this isolation, a place where Marcus could be contradicted without consequence. In private, he stripped away the titles and ceremonies that defined his public role. He reminded himself that he was flesh, aging, temporary, that his body would decay like any other, that his thoughts, too, would vanish. This insistence on impermanence was not morbid, it was corrective. By rehearsing death, Marcus reduced fear. By minimizing his importance, he reduced arrogance. By focusing on conduct rather than outcome, he preserved agency in a world that denied certainty. Yet the very need for these reminders reveals something unsettling. Marcus wrote because he was under constant strain. The philosophy he practiced required effort, not faith. It did not operate automatically. It had to be renewed daily, sometimes hourly. The frequency of repetition suggests how easily equilibrium could be lost. Meditations is often admired for its calm, but beneath that calm lies tension. Marcus struggled. He tired. He doubted. He felt resentment and exhaustion like any other man. The difference was not that he escaped these states, but that he refused to surrender to them. Stoicism did not eliminate suffering. It organized response to it. This distinction matters. Modern readers often treat meditations as a guide to serenity. Marcus did not experience serenity. He experienced pressure, and used philosophy to remain functional under it. The work is therefore less a manual for peace than a record of endurance. It is also deeply lonely. Marcus could not share these thoughts publicly. An emperor who openly questioned power, admitted doubt, or minimized authority risked destabilizing the very system he was meant to preserve. Philosophy, for him, had to remain private. This separation, between public certainty and private questioning, defined his inner life. Meditations reveals a man who ruled without illusion, but also without relief. A man who accepted responsibility fully while denying himself consolation. A man who understood that wisdom did not guarantee success, only coherence. This coherence was his goal. Marcus did not believe philosophy could save the empire. He believed it could prevent him from becoming the kind of ruler who destroyed it more quickly. In this sense, Meditations is not a work of hope. It is a work of discipline. And discipline, while powerful, has limits. No amount of inner clarity can control the actions of others. No philosophy can guarantee good outcomes in a world governed by chance and human weakness. Marcus knew this, and wrote anyway, because writing was how he held the line. But the line would eventually break. Not in war, not in politics, but in family. And it is there, in the decision that would outlive him, that the limits of Stoicism become most visible. Marcus Aurelius believed that most failures could be understood. He did not believe they could always be avoided. This belief sustained him through war, plague, and governance. It did not protect him from the most personal failure of his life. For all his discipline, Marcus remained a husband and a father, and family did not obey philosophy as readily as the self did. Marcus's private life was marked by loss long before Commodus emerged as his heir. He fathered many children, but mortality followed him relentlessly. Sons and daughters died in infancy or early childhood, each loss absorbed quietly without public ritual. Stoicism taught acceptance of death as natural, but repetition still carved absence into his life. Grief, for Marcus, became silent endurance. He did not dramatize it. He did not speak of it publicly. He treated it as another burden to be borne correctly. By the time Commodus survived into adulthood, the emotional weight of continuity had grown immense. The survival of a single son after repeated loss transformed hope into attachment. This context matters deeply, because Marcus's decision cannot be understood without it. Commodus was not merely a successor, he was a survivor. From birth, Commodus existed inside an expectation he did not create. He was raised in the shadow of a father whose discipline bordered on severity, whose public restraint masked constant internal effort. Commodus did not experience obscurity, uncertainty, or formative hardship. He experienced inevitability. Power awaited him. This alone shaped his character. Where Marcus had been formed by restraint, Commodus was shaped by privilege. Where Marcus trained himself to reduce desire, Commodus was indulged by attention. Tutors instructed him, but the structure that had disciplined Marcus, delayed authority, observation from the margins, correction without indulgence, never fully applied. Marcus attempted to bridge this gap. He involved Commodus in public duties early. He granted him titles. He brought him into ceremonies of state. He exposed him to governance not as a prize, but as responsibility. Marcus likely believed that proximity to duty would cultivate seriousness. This belief reflected Marcus's lifelong faith in structure. Stoicism trusted habit, repetition, and example. Marcus had learned discipline by watching Antoninus Pius rule quietly. He hoped Commodus would learn similarly, absorbing restraint through exposure. But exposure is not formation. Ancient sources consistently describe Commodus as impulsive, impatient, and drawn to spectacle. He admired strength as display rather than endurance. He sought admiration rather than coherence. Where Marcus minimized the self, Commodus magnified it. Marcus saw this. There is no serious evidence that he was blind to his son's deficiencies. The question is not whether Marcus recognized the problem, but why he proceeded anyway. Part of the answer lies in exhaustion. By the later years of his reign, Marcus was worn down by decades of war and responsibility. The empire remained fragile. Factional rivalry was always near the surface. The system of adoption that had stabilized Rome for generations depended on the emperor's strength and clarity at the moment of succession. Marcus no longer had the strength for prolonged uncertainty. Naming an adopted successor would invite competition. Ambitious generals, senators, and families would maneuver for position. Civil war was not hypothetical. It was Rome's most familiar disaster. Commodus offered a solution that was deeply flawed, but immediately stabilizing. Bloodline simplified legitimacy. Marcus chose certainty over quality, believing, or perhaps hoping, that institutions could restrain what character lacked. Advisors, laws, precedent, and the memory of Marcus's own example might guide Commodus long enough for Rome to adjust. This was not philosophical blindness. It was political, calculation under fatigue. Stoicism teaches acceptance of what cannot be controlled. Marcus may have accepted that Commodus could not be remade without risking greater harm. In choosing him, Marcus avoided immediate chaos at the cost of future decay. This choice reveals Stoicism's most painful limitation. Acceptance can slide into resignation. Marcus had spent his life restraining impulse, but fatherhood weakened that discipline. Love complicated judgment. Hope softened realism. The desire for continuity, for a son to inherit not just power but meaning, overcame caution. This does not make Marcus irrational. It makes him human. The tragedy lies not in ignorance but in clarity without power to change outcome. Marcus knew virtue could not be inherited. He wrote it explicitly. He knew reason could not be imposed. And yet, when faced with the choice between uncertainty now and decay later, he chose delay. The delay was brief. When Marcus died in 180, the contrast between father and son became immediate and unmistakable. Commodus abandoned the frontier wars not through strategy, but disinterest. He returned to Rome and embraced spectacle, self-display, and cruelty as expressions of authority. The discipline Marcus had enforced evaporated. Institutions did not restrain Commodus. They adapted to him. Advisors flattered rather than corrected. Fear replaced respect. The emperor became performer, and governance became theater. Rome did not collapse overnight, but the tone of power changed. Historians would later mark Marcus's death as the end of Rome's golden age. This judgment is symbolic rather than precise, but it captures something essential. Restraint had lost its champion. Marcus Aurelius had ruled with constant self-correction. Commodus ruled without it. This contrast sharpened Marcus's legacy. The philosopher-emperor became not just an example of wisdom, but a warning about its limits. His greatest failure was not moral, but structural. The belief that systems could compensate for character long enough to preserve order. They could not. Yet it would be a mistake to reduce Marcus's life to this failure. The decision to elevate Commodus does not erase decades of restraint, endurance, and responsible governance. It reveals the boundary beyond which philosophy cannot protect against human attachment. Marcus Aurelius mastered himself. He did not master love. This is what makes his story enduring. His life demonstrates that wisdom does not eliminate tragedy, it clarifies it. That even the most disciplined mind cannot prevent outcomes shaped by affection, fatigue, and hope. Marcus did not fail because he abandoned Stoicism. He failed because Stoicism does not grant control over others, especially those we love most. And in that failure, his humanity becomes undeniable. The philosopher who taught acceptance encountered the one truth philosophy could not soften, that some losses are not avoidable, only survivable. Marcus Aurelius approached death as he had approached life, without illusion and without urgency. By the final years of his reign, Marcus's body no longer matched the discipline of his mind. Illness weakened him. Pain became constant. The long years spent on campaign along the Danube had exhausted what restraint alone could preserve. Yet even as strength faded, he did not withdraw from responsibility. He remained where he believed he was needed. This choice was not heroic. It was habitual. Marcus had trained himself for decades to respond to obligation rather than desire. When death drew near, he did not seek comfort in ceremony or retreat. He stayed among the army, aware that stability mattered more than dignity. The empire still faced pressure. The frontier remained unsettled. Presence, even weakened, carried symbolic weight. Marcus understood symbols. He knew that an emperor who abandoned duty at the end risked unraveling years of effort. So he endured, even as his body failed. Stoicism did not make this easier. It made it expected. Death itself did not frighten him. In his writings, Marcus had returned to the subject repeatedly. He reminded himself that death was not interruption, but completion. That fear arose not from dying, but from clinging. That every life, regardless of scale, resolved into the same end. These reflections were not rehearsals for courage. They were preparations for acceptance. When death came in 180, likely from illness, it arrived without spectacle. There is no record of grand final words meant to impress history. Marcus died quietly, as one more human body yielding to limits he had long acknowledged. Rome mourned deeply. The loss was felt not because Marcus had dazzled, but because he had endured. He had governed without excess. He had restrained power rather than display it. In a world accustomed to theatrical authority, his steadiness had become a kind of moral anchor. Yet mourning did not delay reality. Commodus assumed power without resistance. The transition Marcus had carefully arranged unfolded smoothly, proof that his final calculation had achieved its immediate goal. Order held. The empire did not fracture at once. But calm was temporary. Almost immediately, the contrast between father and son became visible. Discipline dissolved. Governance shifted toward spectacle. Fear replaced respect. Marcus's long restraint, once invisible, became painfully clear in its absence. History judged swiftly. Later, writers would elevate Marcus Aurelius into an idealized figure, the philosopher-emperor, the last ruler of Rome's golden age. This framing simplified reality, but captured something essential. With Marcus's death, a certain style of power ended, leadership rooted in restraint rather than domination. His legacy, however, did not depend on imperial success. It depended on meditations. When Marcus's private writings emerged, they revealed something unprecedented: the inner life of a ruler who doubted himself more than his enemies, a man who commanded armies while reminding himself that power was temporary, a ruler who minimized his own importance even as he held absolute authority. These writings did not instruct others how to rule. They revealed how one man survived ruling. This distinction matters. Marcus did not present philosophy as solution. He presented it as discipline. Meditations offered no assurances that virtue would prevail, that order would last, or that wisdom would be rewarded. It offered only a method for maintaining coherence when outcomes failed. This is why the text endured. Readers across centuries recognized something familiar in Marcus's struggle: the tension between responsibility and control, between effort and inevitability, between intention and result. His reflections spoke not because he was emperor, but because he was human under pressure. Marcus Aurelius did not solve the problem of power. He confronted it honestly. His life demonstrates that restraint can guide authority, but cannot secure the future. That discipline can preserve integrity, but not guarantee legacy. That wisdom can steady a person, but not history. The empire he defended would continue to change, fracture, and transform beyond recognition. Institutions would rise and fall. Names would be forgotten. Borders would dissolve. This impermanence did not trouble Marcus. He expected it. What he hoped to preserve was not Rome forever, but conduct for as long as conduct mattered. He believed that how one acted under pressure was the only lasting measure available. In this sense, Marcus Aurelius succeeded. Not because the empire endured, but because he did not abandon his principles when endurance became difficult. He ruled without illusion, suffered without complaint, and accepted failure without bitterness. His legacy is therefore quiet. It does not rest on conquest, reform, or permanence. It rests on example, on the possibility that power can be exercised without surrendering entirely to it. Marcus Aurelius left no final answers. He left a question. How should one live when responsibility is unavoidable and control is limited? That question remains, and in its persistence, his life continues, not as monument, but as reflection.